some of my major influences was like people like Ray Charles. That's his whole group, the way he had put it together.
Maurice White never forgave Philip Bailey for this.
So we're here doing a video, which is kind of interesting because we're doing a video, making a video of making a...
Maurice had maintained iron-fisted control over every decision in Earth, Wind, and Fire. He was founder, visionary, and business mastermind.
Yeah, definitely the same sense of enjoyment, of fulfillment.
But Bailey's solo success with Easy Lover triggered a Cold War that would poison their relationship for 30 years. This is how ambition destroyed one of music's greatest partnerships. Maurice White didn't just create Earth, Wind, and Fire. He willed it into existence through sheer force of vision and an almost supernatural belief in his own destiny. Born in Memphis in 1941 and raised in the Foot Homes projects, Maurice understood struggle from an early age. But he also possessed something rare, an unshakable conviction that he was meant for greatness. By the time he was working as a session drummer at Chess Records in Chicago, backing legends like Muddy Waters, Etta James, and The Impressions, Maurice had already begun formulating the concept that would become Earth, Wind, and Fire. He wasn't content to simply be another musician for hire. He wanted to create something revolutionary, a band that would bridge the gap between black and white audiences, blend every musical genre imaginable, and deliver messages of universal love and spiritual awakening. When Maurice left the Ramsey Lewis Trio in 1969 to form the Salty Peppers with friends Wade Flemons and Don Whitehead, he was already thinking bigger than a traditional R&B group. The move to Los Angeles and the name change to Earth, Wind, and Fire after the elements in his astrological chart wasn't just rebranding. It was the birth of a musical and spiritual movement. But Maurice's vision came with a price. From the very beginning, he established himself as the unquestioned leader of the band. Every creative decision, every business move, every aspect of their image had to go through him. Band members quickly learned that Maurice White's way was the only way, and those who couldn't accept that reality didn't last long. The original lineup of Earth, Wind, and Fire barely survived 6 months before Maurice dissolved it completely. Members had grown restless under his demanding leadership style and rigid creative control. But rather than compromise his vision, Maurice chose to start over entirely, keeping only his brother Verdine and rebuilding from scratch. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the band's history. Maurice was notorious for firing band members who challenged his authority or failed to meet his exacting standards. He viewed Earth, Wind, and Fire not as a democracy, but as his personal artistic vision brought to life through carefully selected musicians who understood their role in his grand design. When Maurice recruited Philip Bailey in 1972, he found someone whose extraordinary 4-octave vocal range perfectly complemented his own tenor. Bailey's ethereal falsetto became the yin to Maurice's yang, creating the signature vocal interplay that would define Earth, Wind, and Fire's sound for decades. But from the beginning, Maurice made it clear that Bailey was joining his band, not becoming his equal partner. The relationship worked brilliantly in the studio and on stage. Maurice's grounded, earthy vocals provided the foundation, while Bailey's soaring falsetto reached for the heavens. Songs like Reasons, Fantasy, and That's the Way of the World showcased their perfect vocal chemistry. Bailey understood his role and seemed content to let Maurice lead, while he focused on delivering those impossible high notes that made their music so distinctive. But Maurice's controlling nature extended far beyond music. He dictated how band members dressed, how they presented themselves in interviews, and even how they conducted their personal lives. Earth, Wind, and Fire wasn't just a band. It was Maurice's spiritual and artistic kingdom, and everyone in it served at his pleasure. This autocratic leadership style was both the source of their success and the seed of future conflicts. Maurice's uncompromising vision created some of the most innovative and commercially successful music of the 1970s. But it also created an environment where talented musicians felt stifled and undervalued, always living in the shadow of their demanding leader. As Earth, Wind & Fire's success grew throughout the 1970s, so did Maurice's ego and his need for control. Band members began to whisper about his increasingly difficult personality and his unwillingness to share creative or financial credit. But none dared to challenge him directly, except for one moment in 1984 that would change everything. By 1984, Earth, Wind & Fire had achieved everything Maurice White had dreamed of and more. They were selling out arenas worldwide. Their albums went platinum, and their elaborate stage shows had become legendary spectacles featuring disappearing acts, levitating instruments, and enough pyrotechnics to power a small city. They had transcended being merely a band and become a cultural phenomenon. But success brought its own challenges. After more than a decade of non-stop recording and touring, several band members were feeling creatively restless. The cosmic spirituality and positive messaging that defined Earth, Wind & Fire's public image masked growing tensions within the group about creative direction, financial arrangements, and individual recognition. Philip Bailey had been the perfect complement to Maurice's vision for 12 years, delivering those impossible falsetto runs that made songs like September and Boogie Wonderland transcendent. But as he approached his mid-30s, Bailey began to question whether he was reaching his full potential as an artist. While he was universally recognized as one of the greatest vocalists of his generation, he remained in Maurice's shadow when it came to songwriting credits, production roles, and public recognition. The music industry in the early 1980s was experiencing a shift toward individual stardom. Artists like Michael Jackson, Prince, and Madonna were proving that solo careers could eclipse even the most successful groups. Record labels were actively courting established band members, offering them unprecedented creative freedom and financial incentives to step out on their own. When Phil Collins approached Bailey about collaborating on a solo album, it represented everything Bailey had been quietly longing for. Collins was at the height of his popularity, coming off massive successes with Genesis and his own solo career. He offered Bailey something Maurice never had: the opportunity to be the undisputed star of his own project. The album that became Chinese Wall was recorded in secret, with Bailey and Collins working together in London while Earth, Wind & Fire was on a brief hiatus. For Bailey, it was a revelation. Collins treated him as an equal partner, encouraging his input on arrangements, song selection, and even production decisions. After years of having every creative choice filtered through Maurice's vision, the freedom was intoxicating. But Bailey knew he was walking into dangerous territory. Maurice had made it clear from the beginning that Earth, Wind & Fire came first, always and without exception. Band members were expected to channel their creative energies into the group, not pursue outside projects that might dilute their commitment or compete for attention. The recording sessions for Chinese Wall were kept deliberately low profile. Bailey told very few people about the project, knowing that word would eventually reach Maurice and that there would be consequences. But as the album took shape and the undeniable chemistry between Bailey and Collins became apparent, the secret became harder to keep. When Easy Lover, Bailey's duet with Collins, was released as the lead single in late 1984, it became an immediate sensation. The song shot to #1 in the UK and broke into the top 5 in the US, giving Bailey his first and only solo chart topper. The success was everything he had hoped for and everything Maurice had feared. For the first time in Earth, Wind & Fire's history, one of Maurice's band members had achieved major success outside the group. Worse, that success came from working with a white British musician who represented everything Maurice had positioned earth, wind, and fire against. The colonization of black music by white artists who received greater commercial success and mainstream acceptance. Maurice's reaction was swift and decisive. While he didn't publicly criticize Bailey's solo venture, those close to the band noticed an immediate cooling in their relationship. The easy camaraderie that had characterized their partnership for over a decade was replaced by professional politeness and barely concealed tension. The success of Chinese Wall and Easy Lover put Bailey in an impossible position. He had tasted the freedom and recognition that came with being the star of his own project, but he also understood that his future was inextricably linked to earth, wind, and fire. The question was whether Maurice would ever truly forgive what he saw as an act of betrayal, or whether this moment of independence had permanently altered the dynamic between them. The success of Philip Bailey's Chinese Wall album created a crisis within earth, wind, and fire that went far beyond simple jealousy or wounded ego. For Maurice White, Bailey's solo venture represented a fundamental challenge to the carefully constructed hierarchy that had governed the band for over a decade. Maurice had built earth, wind, and fire on the principle of collective identity, subservient to his singular vision. Every member understood that their individual talents served the greater good of the group, and, more importantly, that their careers existed at Maurice's discretion. Bailey's solo success shattered that understanding and exposed the inherent tension between individual ambition and group loyalty. The commercial triumph of Easy Lover was particularly galling to Maurice because it demonstrated that Bailey could achieve mainstream success without him. The song's massive radio play and MTV rotation proved that Bailey's voice could carry a hit record on its own, without the elaborate musical arrangements, spiritual messaging, and cosmic theatricality that Maurice considered essential to their appeal. Even more troubling was the racial dynamic of Bailey's collaboration with Phil Collins. Maurice had spent his entire career fighting against the music industry's tendency to elevate white artists over equally talented black musicians. He had deliberately crafted Earth, Wind, and Fire's image and sound to be undeniably African American, while still appealing to mainstream audiences. Bailey's partnership with Collins felt like a betrayal of that mission. The tension came to a head during Earth, Wind, and Fire's 1985 recording sessions for what would become their Touch the World album. Band members noticed that Maurice's interactions with Bailey had become notably colder and more formal. The easy creative partnership that had produced their greatest hits was replaced by a professional distance that affected the entire group's dynamic. Maurice began asserting even tighter control over the band's creative process, seemingly determined to remind everyone, especially Bailey, who was in charge. Songs that Bailey had written or co-written were subjected to extensive revision under Maurice's direction. Vocal arrangements that showcased Bailey's range were altered to feature more of Maurice's lead vocals. The message was clear: Earth, Wind, and Fire belonged to Maurice White, and everyone else was replaceable. The psychological impact on Bailey was profound. After experiencing the creative freedom and equal partnership that came with his solo work, returning to Maurice's autocratic leadership style felt stifling and demeaning. The man who had been his mentor and musical brother for 13 years now treated him with suspicion and barely concealed resentment. Other band members found themselves caught in the middle of this cold war between their two leaders. The joyful, family-like atmosphere that had characterized Earth, Wind, and Fire's best years was replaced by an undercurrent of tension that affected everyone's performance and creativity. Recording sessions became exercises in walking on eggshells, with everyone careful not to take sides or say anything that might escalate the conflict. The situation was made worse by the music industry's reaction to Bailey's solo success. Record executives and music journalists began referring to him as a breakout star, and speculating about his future plans. Interview requests poured in, most of them focused on Bailey's solo career rather than Earth, Wind & Fire's upcoming projects. For Maurice, who had always been the band's primary spokesperson and public face, this shift in attention was deeply threatening. Maurice's response was to double down on his control and authority. He made it clear through his actions, if not his words, that Bailey's solo career was a distraction from his real job, which was serving Earth, Wind & Fire's mission. The creative partnership that had produced classics like Reasons and Fantasy became a power struggle, with Maurice determined to reassert his dominance and Bailey struggling to maintain some sense of artistic autonomy. The fracture in their relationship affected more than just their personal dynamic. It fundamentally altered the creative chemistry that had made Earth, Wind & Fire special. The vocal interplay between Maurice's grounded tenor and Bailey's ethereal falsetto, which had been based on mutual respect and shared vision, now carried undertones of competition and resentment that audiences could sense even if they couldn't articulate it. As 1985 turned into 1986, it became clear that something essential had been broken in the relationship between Maurice White and Philip Bailey. The question was whether their shared history and musical chemistry could overcome the damage, or whether Bailey's moment of independence had created a rift that would never fully heal. The period following Philip Bailey's solo success marked the beginning of Earth, Wind & Fire's most challenging era. Maurice White's response to what he perceived as Bailey's betrayal was not explosive confrontation, but something far more devastating, a gradual freezing out that would last for years. Maurice had always been a master of psychological warfare within the band, using his position as founder and leader to control behavior through subtle intimidation rather than direct confrontation. With Bailey, he employed this strategy with surgical precision. While maintaining professional civility in public, Maurice systematically began diminishing Bailey's role within the group. The clearest evidence of this shift came in the songwriting and production credits for Earth, Wind & Fire's subsequent albums. Bailey, who had previously been included as a co-writer on many of the band's songs, found his contributions increasingly marginalized or uncredited altogether. Maurice began working more closely with outside writers and producers, effectively cutting Bailey out of the creative process that had once been their shared domain. During recording sessions, Maurice would often address Bailey through intermediaries rather than speaking to him directly. When they did interact, Maurice's tone was coldly professional, lacking any trace of the warmth and brotherhood that had characterized their relationship for over a decade. The man who had once called Bailey his musical soulmate now treated him like an employee who couldn't be trusted. The impact on Bailey was devastating. He had spent 13 years as Maurice's creative partner and closest collaborator, only to find himself suddenly treated as an outsider in the band he had helped build. The success of Easy Lover and Chinese Wall, which should have been a source of pride and validation, instead became a source of isolation and regret. Other band members watched this dynamic with a mixture of sympathy and self-preservation. While many privately felt that Maurice was being unfairly punitive toward Bailey, none dared to intervene or take sides. Maurice's track record of firing band members who challenged his authority was well known, and everyone understood that speaking up for Bailey could mean the end of their own careers. The situation was complicated by Earth, Wind & Fire's continued commercial success during this period. Despite the internal tensions, albums like Touch the World and Heritage produced hit singles and kept the band in the public eye. To outsiders, everything appeared normal, but those within the organization knew that the creative partnership at the heart of the band had been irreparably damaged. Maurice's treatment of Bailey extended beyond the recording studio. During interviews and public appearances, Maurice would often speak about the band's history and success without acknowledging Bailey's contributions. He began referring to himself as the sole creative force behind Earth, Wind and Fire's sound, effectively erasing Bailey's role in their greatest achievements. The psychological toll on Bailey was immense. He had achieved the solo success he had dreamed of, but it had cost him his musical family and his sense of belonging in the band that had defined his adult life. The joy and spiritual connection that had made Earth, Wind and Fire's music so powerful was replaced by anxiety and alienation. By the late 1980s, the tension between Maurice and Bailey had become an open secret within the music industry. Other musicians and industry insiders were aware of the rift, though few understood its origins or depth. Some attributed it to typical band dynamics and ego conflicts, not realizing that it stemmed from a fundamental disagreement about loyalty, independence, and the nature of their artistic partnership. The situation reached a breaking point during the recording of Earth, Wind and Fire's 1990 album, Heritage. Bailey's vocal contributions were minimized to the point where he appeared on only a handful of tracks, and his once prominent falsetto was buried in the mix beneath Maurice's lead vocals and guest singers. For fans who had grown up listening to the Bailey-White vocal interplay, the album felt incomplete and unsatisfying. The message Maurice was sending was clear: Philip Bailey could be replaced. The 4-octave vocal range that had once been considered indispensable to Earth, Wind and Fire's sound was now being treated as a luxury that the band could do without. For Bailey, who had built his entire identity around his role in the group, this marginalization was more painful than being fired outright. As the 1990s progressed, it became apparent that Maurice White would never fully forgive Philip Bailey for his moment of independence. The trust and mutual respect that had fueled their greatest collaborations was gone, replaced by a professional relationship defined by suspicion and resentment that would color the rest of their time together. By the early 1990s, the relationship between Maurice White and Philip Bailey had settled into a pattern of cold professionalism that would define their interactions for the remainder of Maurice's life. What had once been one of music's greatest creative partnerships had become a cautionary tale about the price of individual ambition within a collective artistic vision. Maurice's Parkinson's disease diagnosis in the early 1990s added another layer of complexity to their fractured relationship. As the founder and driving force behind Earth, Wind and Fire began to step back from touring due to his declining health. Bailey found himself increasingly thrust into the role of the band's primary frontman and public face. The irony was profound. The man Maurice had spent years marginalizing was now essential to preserving his legacy. The transition of leadership from Maurice to Bailey was gradual and unspoken. By 1994, Maurice had largely withdrawn from regular touring, appearing only occasionally for special events. Bailey, along with Verdine White and Ralph Johnson, became the keepers of the Earth, Wind and Fire flame, responsible for maintaining the band's reputation and continuing their musical mission. But even as Bailey assumed greater responsibility for the band's day-to-day operations, Maurice maintained tight control over the business side of Earth, Wind and Fire. He retained ownership of the band's name, catalog, and image, ensuring that Bailey and the other members remained essentially employees rather than partners. The message was clear: Bailey might be the face of Earth, Wind and Fire on stage, but Maurice White would always be its owner and ultimate authority. The personal cost of their fractured relationship extended beyond just the two principals. Other longtime band members found themselves navigating the complex dynamics between their founder and their most visible performer. The family-like atmosphere that had once characterized Earth, Wind and Fire was replaced by professional courtesy masking deep-seated tensions. For Bailey, the situation was particularly painful because it prevented any real reconciliation with the man who had been his mentor, collaborator, and friend for over 2 decades. As Maurice's health declined, opportunities for healing their relationship became increasingly rare. The spiritual brotherhood that had once connected them seemed irretrievably lost. Maurice's approach to their relationship remained consistent until the end. He never publicly criticized Bailey's solo career or spoke negatively about their personal dynamics. Instead, he maintained a facade of unity, while privately holding on to his resentment about what he saw as Bailey's betrayal. In interviews, Maurice would praise Bailey's vocal abilities while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of their personal bond or creative partnership. The impact of their fractured relationship on Earth, Wind and Fire's music was subtle but significant. While the band continued to perform their classic hits with technical proficiency, the emotional connection and spiritual energy that had made their original recording so powerful was diminished. The vocal interplay between Maurice and Bailey, when it occurred at all, lacked the seamless chemistry that had defined their greatest work. Bailey's solo career continued sporadically throughout the 1990s and 2000s, but never again reached the commercial heights of Chinese Wall. The success that had triggered Maurice's lasting resentment proved to be both the peak and the end of Bailey's individual stardom. He remained trapped between two worlds, too associated with Earth, Wind, and Fire to be seen as a true solo artist, but too marginalized within the band to feel fulfilled creatively. When Maurice White passed away in February 2016, Bailey's public statements were gracious and respectful, focusing on Maurice's musical genius and his impact on their shared legacy. But those close to Bailey knew that Maurice's death represented not just the loss of a collaborator, but the end of any possibility for the reconciliation that both men had perhaps secretly hoped for. In the years since Maurice's passing, Bailey has assumed full leadership of Earth, Wind, and Fire, finally achieving the recognition and authority that had been denied to him for so long. He speaks lovingly of Maurice's vision and their shared history, carefully maintaining the image of brotherhood that defines the band's public legacy. But the truth remains that one of music's greatest partnerships was irreparably damaged by a single moment of individual ambition. Maurice White never truly forgave Philip Bailey for stepping outside the collective vision, and that lack of forgiveness poisoned their relationship for over 30 years. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.